Mill breaks into our house and reads our son's journal after we tried to set boundaries. Me, 30F, and my husband, 32M, have been together for 8 years, married for 5. We have a wonderful 3-year-old son, and life has been pretty great overall. My husband has a good job, and I'm a stay-at-home mom. We live in a nice suburban neighborhood, and our neighbors are friendly. My mother-in-law, 62F, however, has always been a source of tension in our lives. She's a wealthy widow, and she's always been quite controlling and manipulative, especially when it comes to my husband. She's never really approved of me, and she's made that clear in subtle, and not so subtle, ways over the years. Things came to a head a few months ago when my mother-in-law announced that she was moving into our neighborhood. She bought a massive house just a couple of blocks away, supposedly to be closer to her grandchild. My husband was thrilled at the prospect, but I was immediately worried. My mother-in-law has a history of overstepping boundaries and trying to control every aspect of our lives. She's also incredibly critical of my parenting style, constantly making snide comments about how I'm raising our son wrong. One day, I was out running errands with my son when I noticed a fancy new car parked in our driveway. As we got closer, I saw my mother-in-law getting out of the car, letting herself into our house with a spare key. I was absolutely livid. I stormed inside, and sure enough, she was making herself at home in our living room, criticizing the way I had the house set up and the mess my son had made with his toys. When I confronted her about letting herself in without permission, she simply shrugged it off and said, "I'm family. I don't need permission." From that point on, it became a regular occurrence. My mother-in-law would just show up unannounced, letting herself in and rearranging things to her liking. She'd go through our pantry and fridge, throwing out food she deemed unhealthy. She'd reorganize my son's toys and clothes, and even go into our bedroom and make comments about our personal lives. It was a complete invasion of privacy, and it was driving me insane. My husband tried to talk to her about it, but she just brushed him off, saying she was just trying to help. Things came to a head one day when I caught my mother-in-law going through my personal journals. I had been using them to vent about the stress of her constant intrusions, and she had clearly read them. When I confronted her, she had the audacity to say that she was just trying to understand me better. I lost it. I screamed at her to get out of my house and never come back without an invitation. She stormed out, but not before telling me that I was an ungrateful, terrible wife and mother who didn't deserve her son. My husband was caught in the middle, torn between his loyalty to me and his desire to maintain a relationship with his mother. He tried to reason with her, but she refused to apologize or acknowledge that she had done anything wrong. Instead, she started a campaign of manipulation and guilt-tripping. She would call my husband constantly, berating him for taking my side and accusing me of turning him against her. She would show up unannounced, trying to force her way into our home, and even started sending nasty letters and emails. The final straw came when we discovered that my mother-in-law had been going into our son's room while we were out and reading his personal journal. She had been using it to gather information about our family and fuel her criticisms of our parenting. When we confronted her about it, she didn't even deny it. She said she was just trying to understand her grandson better since we were clearly failing as parents. That was it for me. I told my husband that we needed to take legal action to protect ourselves and our son from her toxic behavior. We hired a lawyer and sent my mother-in-law a cease and desist letter, warning her that if she didn't stop her harassment and invasion of privacy, we would pursue a restraining order. She responded by doubling down on her campaign, sending us threatening letters and even showing up at our son's school to try and see him without our permission. It was a nightmare. We were constantly on edge, never knowing when she would show up or what she would do next. My husband was struggling with the guilt of cutting his mother out of our lives, but he knew it was necessary for our own safety and well-being. Despite the cease and desist letter, my mother-in-law's behavior only escalated. One day, we came home to find that she had broken into our house and completely trashed the place. Furniture was overturned, dishes were smashed, and our personal belongings were strewn everywhere. It was a clear act of retaliation for our legal threats, and it was terrifying. We immediately called the police and filed a report, but my mother-in-law had already fled the scene. We had no choice but to pursue a restraining order at that point. The restraining order process was long and exhausting. My mother-in-law fought at every step of the way, claiming that we were the ones harassing her and that she had every right to be involved in our lives as a grandmother. She even tried to turn the tables on us, accusing me of alienating her from her grandchild and claiming that my husband was under my spell. It was a nightmare, but eventually, the judge saw through her lies and granted us a temporary restraining order, ordering her to stay at least 500 feet away from us at all times. Even with the restraining order in place, my mother-in-law refused to back down. She would show up outside our house or follow us in public, always staying just outside the 500-foot boundary. She would send us constant letters and emails, filled with insults and threats. At one point, she even tried to hire a private investigator to follow us and dig up dirt on our personal lives. It was a constant state of fear and anxiety, never knowing what she would do next or how far she would go to get her way. Eventually, my mother-in-law's behavior became so extreme that we had no choice but to pursue criminal charges. She had violated the restraining order multiple times, and her harassment had become a form of stalking. It was a long and difficult legal battle, but in the end, she was found guilty of stalking and harassment. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail and ordered to pay a hefty fine. We also obtained a permanent restraining order, ensuring that she could never come near us or our son again. The legal process was draining, both emotionally and financially. We had to hire multiple lawyers and spent countless hours in court, reliving the trauma of my mother-in-law's behavior over and over again. But in the end, it was worth it. We finally had a sense of peace and security, knowing that she could no longer invade our lives or terrorize us with her toxic behavior. It was a hard-won victory, but one that allowed us to start healing and moving on. The emotional aftermath of this ordeal has been significant. My husband has struggled with feelings of guilt and betrayal, having to cut ties with his own mother in such a dramatic way. He's had to come to terms with the fact that the woman who gave birth to him is a deeply troubled and toxic person, and that's been a difficult pill to swallow. As for me, I've had to work through feelings of anger, fear, and resentment. I've had to learn to trust again and let go of the constant state of anxiety that my mother-in-law's behavior had instilled in me. It's been a long and ongoing process, but we're taking it one day at a time. If you're dealing with a toxic family member who refuses to respect boundaries and is causing harm to your mental and emotional well-being, don't be afraid to take legal action. It's not an easy road, but sometimes it's the only way to protect yourself and your loved ones. Remember, you have a right to feel safe and secure in your own home, and no one should be allowed to violate that. Seek support from friends, family, and professionals, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, even if it means cutting ties with someone you care about. Your peace of mind and well-being are worth fighting for, and you deserve to live a life free from harassment and abuse. Stay strong, and know that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Break Story 2. Me, 38F, and my husband Dan, 40M, have been married for 12 years. We have 2 amazing kids, Emma, 10F, and Jacob, 8M. Dan comes from an extremely wealthy family that made their fortune in real estate development. His parents, Richard, 65M, and Karen, 62F, are narcissistic control freaks who have always tried to run our lives. When we first got married, they demanded we live in one of their investment properties rent-free so they could keep an eye on us. They'd show up unannounced all the time to criticize how we kept the place, how we raised the kids, how I cooked, you name it. I come from a working-class family, so their snobbish ways have always rubbed me the wrong way. About 5 years ago, Dan's dad Richard got diagnosed with early-onset dementia. His personality changed drastically, he became paranoid, delusional, and occasionally violent. Karen couldn't handle it and moved into their vacation home, leaving a crew of nurses and home aides to care for Richard at their main residence. Dan and I tried to help where we could, but Karen became extremely difficult. She'd accuse the aides of stealing, fire them constantly, and then beg us to find replacements while insulting our choices. It was a nightmare. Eventually, we'd had enough of her abuse and told her we couldn't be involved in Richard's care anymore for our own sanity. She responded by cutting Dan out of their will and family trust, which was no surprise given her vengeful nature. A few months ago, Jacob accidentally knocked over a lamp and found an envelope stuffed with cash, over $50,000. We couldn't believe our eyes. Where had this money come from? Dan and I have good jobs but nothing that would allow us to save that kind of crazy money. When we sat the kids down, Emma revealed that Grandpa Richard's friends had been giving her envelopes of cash for months whenever they came over. They told her it was their little secret and she shouldn't tell us. My heart dropped. We pressed Emma for more details. Apparently, these shady men would show up every few weeks, give her an envelope stuffed with bills, and tell her to keep it safe until her grandpa could come collect it. The sums ranged from $5,000 to $20,000 each time. Dan was beside himself. His dad's dementia had caused him to revert to bad habits from his younger days. Richard had ties to organized crime decades ago, which was how he originally obtained the seed money for his development business. We realized he must have fallen back into that world as his mind deteriorated. Dan immediately drove over to his parents' house, where he found his mom Karen entertaining a couple of those shady friends. He laid into her, demanding to know what was going on with the cash deliveries to our daughter. Karen just smirked and said, "It's just a little money Richard put aside in case we needed it. Those men are old family friends helping me manage things while your father is indisposed." Dan wasn't buying it. He knew his dad's net worth. There was no way this was legit money. When he insisted we were going to the authorities, Karen's demeanor shifted. "Do that, and you'll destroy what's left of your father's legacy," Karen hissed. "The businesses, the estate, everything will be picked apart by the government. We'd be destitute. Is that what you want for your precious children's future?" I could see Dan wavering. As mad as he was, he still loved his dad. And that rotten woman knew just how to push his buttons when it came to providing for our family. "This is just temporary until Richard gets back on his feet," Karen insisted. "Once he's better, everything will go back to normal. But if you go running to the cops, it'll ruin us all." Dan and I spent the next few days agonizing over what to do. The idea of those criminals using our daughter to launder money made me sick. But could we really let decades of Richard's legitimate hard work and earnings be decimated? We decided to get the full truth out of Emma first. After much coaxing and assuring her she wasn't in trouble, she finally admitted that the men had been sexually abusing her in exchange for the cash deliveries. We were devastated and felt like failing parents. We brought Emma to the hospital, where a rape kit confirmed our worst fears. Dan absolutely lost it. He went nuclear, calling the FBI, DEA, IRS, any law enforcement agency that would listen. When we got home, Karen was beside herself, screaming at us for airing the family's dirty laundry. Dan punched a hole clean through the wall and told her that if she ever came near our kids again, he'd kill her himself. Karen's smugness turned to panic as she realized Dan wasn't bluffing this time. She turned into a blubbering mess, suddenly concerned only with protecting her own wealth. Things moved swiftly after Dan's massive law enforcement overreaction. Within days, federal agents swarmed the family properties with battering rams and search warrants. It turned out Richard's decline had allowed an old criminal partner to reinsert himself into the business. He was using Richard's homes, staff, and finances to run an incredibly lucrative fraud and racketeering scheme. The cash they were giving Emma was just a drop in the bucket to keep Richard's addled mind complacent. Every asset owned by Dan's family was seized by the government as probable cause for forfeiture. The family friends turned out to be violent felons with international arrest warrants. Karen went into complete meltdown mode as her entire world collapsed around her. Karen despised me from day one for being a lowly commoner in her eyes. Now that her empire was crumbling, she directed her vitriol fully at me and the kids. She accused me of masterminding this whole takedown to get revenge for her icy treatment over the years. She claimed I had brainwashed Emma into fabricating the sexual abuse claims. She said vile, unforgivable things about my children that I'll never be able to unhear. The final straw was when she made thinly veiled threats about hiring a cleaner to take care of my lying brats once she inevitably made bail. Dan went nuclear again, this time calling the U.S. Marshals himself to have her arrested for witness intimidation. While Karen sat behind bars awaiting trial, every dirty secret about the family's finances was gradually exposed. The criminal charges kept piling up: tax evasion, money laundering, embezzlement, you name it. The feds were throwing the book at them. Richard's medical evaluations revealed that his dementia had scrambled his mind for years already. He was declared psychologically unfit, so all culpability fell on Karen's shoulders for allowing the situation to spiral so disastrously while pulling the strings herself. With her castle of lies deteriorating around her, Karen's hatred for me only grew more unhinged. She repeatedly violated court orders to have no contact with us, mailing vile letters and leaving psychotic voicemails that made Emma scared to answer the phone. Karen's arrogance proved to be her undoing. After violating her conditions of bail one too many times, the judge threw the book at her. She was handed a 25-year sentence for racketeering, fraud, and intimidating witnesses/victims. On top of that, the family was hit with one of the largest federal forfeiture judgments in history, over $850 million in assets seized by the government. Every penny of their ill-gotten gains was clawed back. Dan was sickened by the revelations of how his family's wealth was obtained. But a small weight was lifted knowing his father's life work wouldn't be erased, even if they'd never see a dime of it again. With Karen living out her golden years behind bars, we worried she might try to retaliate once she inevitably got out. So we took steps to cover our tracks. We legally changed our names and relocated across the country with new identities, scrubbing virtually every connection to our former lives. The kids had to start at new schools, but they were so traumatized that a total reset was needed anyway. The U.S. Marshals provided assistance with relocating us to undisclosed locations and monitoring for any issues. For the first time in over a decade, we felt like we could exhale and live without Karen's dark cloud hanging over us. Even though the legal situation was largely resolved and we were safely distanced from Karen's toxic influence, the emotional scars ran deep, especially for Emma. Years of trauma therapy lay ahead. She struggled with nightmares, anxiety, and guilt over the horrific abuse she endured at such a young age. We did everything we could to reassure her that she was the victim and none of it was her fault. Jacob had a tough road ahead too. Seeing his big sister victimized, experiencing his family's wealth disappear overnight, then being ripped from his school and friends, it was a lot for a little kid to process. I'm just thankful we caught the situation when we did before it could get even worse. Healing will take time, but we're fortunate to have emerged from this nightmare when so many don't. Looking back, I realized that money and status truly do corrupt. We were just normal people until Dan's family sucked us into their vortex of greed and criminality. For Karen, material wealth was the only thing that mattered, no matter how tainted the sources were. I'll never regret the actions we took to cut that cancerous influence out of our lives. Yes, we lost everything, but we survived. And more importantly, we protected our children when Karen's depravity put them in harm's way. If reading this saga teaches you anything, let it be this: the richest things in life are not measured by your bank accounts, but by the bonds of family, love and integrity you cultivate every single day.